Hi, I'd like to speak about castling in chess, how to do the castling move. So when you castle in chess, it involves moving both the king and the rook in the same move. First you would move the king 2 squares. Don't know how to do it without getting my arm in the way of the view. So the king goes 2 squares across towards the corner, and the rook moves to the other side of the king. You must move the king first when castling before you move the rook to indicate that you're castling and not moving the rook by itself. For example, if you move the rook first, it looks like you're just moving the rook by itself and you're not indicating to your opponent that you intend to castle. So when castling, you should and must move the king 2 squares towards the corner and the rook to the other side of the king. This is the only time the king goes 2 squares and the only time you move 2 pieces in one move, the king and the rook, known as castling. You can castle on either side of the board, on the king side of the board or the queen side of the board. But you have to meet a lot of criteria to be able to castle. So this is the king side of the board where you can castle, or you can castle on the queen side of the board if you meet all the castling criteria that allows you to castle. The first thing about castling is there has to be an empty square separating the king and the rook. So on this side, that's met. There's empty squares separating the king and the rook. So that's one criteria. Nothing in between the king and the rook on the side you castle on. So on the king side, there's empty squares separating the king and the rook. Second criteria, these are in no order. You have to follow all of them to castle. No order. The second criteria is that it has to be the king's first move and the rook involved its first move. So pretend the king and the rook haven't moved yet, which is clearly the case because they're on their starting positions. Well, that's not always true because a king could move, white moves, and then black moves back to their starting square with the king. Like now, black can't castle at all for this game because the king's already moved. Even though they've moved back to their starting square, they can't castle. There's got to be the king's first move and the rook involved its first move. So empty square separating the king and the rook. And both pieces first move. And another criteria is, this is the only rule in chess I don't agree with, but it has to be followed as it's a rule. Say the enemy or the opponent rather gives check, attacking your king. While in check you cannot castle. You cannot castle out of check. It's such a bizarre rule. I don't understand why that rule is the way it is. But it is a rule. You can't castle when in check. You can castle later on, but not at the time you're in check. Another rule, another criteria, the rest of them make sense in my opinion, but that one doesn't. Like another criteria, fourth criteria is the king cannot pass through an attacked square when castling. So the king would normally go 2 squares towards the corner and the rook jumps to the other side. In this case, it's an illicit move because the reason it's illegal is because the king is passing through a checked square. This square is checked from the opponent's rook. So the king cannot cross through it to castle rather. It's illegal. And the last criteria is pretty obvious. It's pretty self-explanatory. since you don't want to go, since you're not allowed to put yourself in check, it's illegal. This should be obvious, but the rook comes over here, and black cannot castle on the king side for the time being because they would land in check once castled. So you're not allowed to castle because the king's landing in check. So it's not allowed. You're not allowed to put yourself in check after castling. Moving over to the queen side of the board. So, and another criteria is, I think I've said this, there has to be an empty, all the squares separating the king and the rook have to be empty. So that means, in this position, the king cannot castle on the queen side until the queen and knight have moved the queen side of the board. The queen side, and the other side being the king side. This is the king side. And this is the queen side of the board. So on the queen side, the queen and the knight have to move. If they're not there, I'll just take them off the board, just pretend we're not there. So we're not here anymore. So you would castle by moving the king 2 squares across to the corner. And the rook goes to the other side of the king. That's how you castle. In this position, you're allowed to, because it's the rook that passed through an attacked square from the opponent's rook, not the king. So, I'll show that again. The rook is allowed to pass through this square, because it's not the king moving through an attacked square. The rook is allowed to. So, the king would go 2 squares across, and the rook jumps to the other side of the king. And that's allowed as castling queenside. So castling queenside is known as castling long. Another terminology, castling long. And castling on the king side is castling short. In both cases, whichever side you castle on, if you do castle, you need to move the king 2 squares towards the corner and meet all the criteria to castle. After the king has moved 2 squares, then the rook goes to the other side of the king. After the king has moved 2 squares. We don't move the rook first, because that looks like you just want to move the rook by itself. You're not indicating your intention to castle. So the king goes 2 squares first, and then the rook to the other side of the king. And the idea of castling is to, depending on the setup, like the position between you and your opponent, you'd want to make your king more safe from getting the king out of the centre of the board and get your rook out of the corner. They're the main reasons for castling. To make your king safe by getting him out of the centre, because he's under attack more likely in the centre. That's in general, not always. You've got to consider what's happening on the board. And you want to get your rook out of the corner of the board. So they're the main reasons for castling. King safety and activate the rook away out of the corner. I'm going to upload a lot of chess videos in the next week or two. A lot. Thank you for watching. Bye.